Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us wherever you may be in the world. I was going to say good morning there because I know there are some people watching us who are having a morning cup of tea or whatever it might be, or good afternoon, good evening. We've got 700 or so people who are staff and students and alumni, local community supporters just scattered around the globe. And it's great to have you with us. For those of you that don't know me, my name's John Inverdale, and I am a graduate of the University of Southampton. A long, long time ago, I was captain of the university tennis team, first 15 rugby player, editor of the university magazine for 2 years. And I suppose the key thing to say about that is that the link that has, which is going to be part of our sort of discussion this evening, is that what I did at university directly took me on to what I did subsequently for 30 odd years. This is the first Olympic Games I've missed for more than 30 years or so. And I suppose actually what makes me especially relevant to this discussion that we're having this evening is that I actually went out for 18 months with, I think, the first girl ever to do ship science at the University of Southampton. So that obviously makes me a huge authority on the subject. A bit of housekeeping, the hour, and we are going to be strict on our timekeeping as well. The sort of first 20 minutes or so is going to be a chat with our three guests. And then after that, it's questions from the floor, wherever you may be, and I'm sure there are going to be an awful lot of them. So to that end, if you look at the right hand of your screen, you will see a thing that says Q&A box. So if you go in there, start with your name, and if selected, we will ask your question on your behalf. And obviously, we'll try and get through as many questions as is humanly possible. And so, on to our speakers. So first up, it's Emily Nagel, who graduated from Southampton in 2016 with an MEng in Naval Architecture and Marine Engineering. She's competed in the Youth America's Cup. She was the youngest female competitor in the Volvo Ocean Race in 2017-18. She currently works as a performance data analyst. And in June this year, Emily competed in the Ocean Race Europe, winning her class, I'm delighted to say. Our second speaker, James Roche, graduated in 2010 with a BEng in ship science and an EngD in aerodynamics and racing simulation. He was a member of Team GB's support staff for 2 consecutive Winter Olympics, co-designing the gold medal winning skeleton sleds for Amy Williams and Lizzie Arnold. He recently worked for Ineos Team UK and at the start of this year was part of the America's Cup team out in New Zealand. And he's recently begun working at a sustainable fintech company. And the gentleman on your right is Dr. Joseph Banks, a lecturer in ship science and maritime engineering at Southampton. He also studied here, completing his degree in 2009, going on to obtain a PhD in 2013. His research primarily focuses on the fluid dynamics involved in the resistance and propulsion of ships, yachts, athletes, and their equipment. So it's on water and on land. And he currently leads the university's research partnership with the English Institute of Sport and leads the module on yacht and high performance craft. So that's a pretty high flying triumvirate that you have at your disposal for the next 57 minutes. So do get your questions coming in as quickly as you possibly can do. And I'll have a chat with the 3 other individuals on your screen at the moment, and then we'll get round to your questions a bit later on. First of all, we have a slight variation in ages here, so let's talk about our university experiences. Emily, I'll start with you. Why did you go to Southampton in the first place?
Well, originally I wasn't actually signed up to do ship science. Originally I applied to do mechanical engineering at obviously a bunch of different universities. But when I was looking around, I just absolutely fell in love with Southampton, and I couldn't really tell why. It was just that it was friendly. I loved being by the water, and I just, then and there, the day I looked around the uni, it was like, yeah, this is my first choice. Doesn't matter where else I go, like get into, I'm really happy here. And then, yeah, started out that September. But I very quickly learned that there was actually a course that was like mechanical engineering, except rather than focusing on cars, you got to focus on boats, and you still came out of it with an MEng. So I think it was about 5 weeks in when I finally caved and switched over and joined the dark side with all the shippies.
And did you at the time feel that was the first step to something, whatever it might be?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was that moment where I kind of realized that hobbies and a career don't have to be completely separate. I'd always kind of grown up thinking that like my sailing, swimming, all of those were like hobbies and they're what I did for fun, and I could compete at a high level, but I then had to have a career that was separate. While doing ship science, I suddenly realized that I could combine what I loved with also a career and look at the technical side and yeah, just all of these things I'd never really thought of doing before. And suddenly I was like, oh, I can have both.
Yeah, it's amazing making a career out of a hobby. It really is. Writing and talking. I mean, what kind of a job is that? But, I somehow managed to do it for 30 or 40 years. James, what about you?
Yeah, my story's not too dissimilar. As a teenager, I was just absolutely passionate about sailing. I kind of reorganized every aspect of my life to try and be out on the water as much as possible. And I remember watching the 2000 America's Cup in Auckland, actually, and just looking at this thing and going, what the hell is that? I had no concept of it before. The America's Cup tends to fly under the radar a little bit and then pops up, and that's what it was like for me. At that point, I'm like, I've got to be involved in this. And it didn't take too much research to realize that, most of the people who were involved in those teams, that time had some link, or a majority had some link back to Southampton. And so, teachers have been telling me that engineering might be a way to go. And then suddenly everything sort of clicked together. And, the added appeal of Southampton being close to the water and close to the kind of the center of, yachting and racing in the UK, it was a no-brainer.
Even at that stage, did you kind of see it as a means to an end, do you think? Or were you not looking at it in those terms?
If I'm honest, yes, I suppose it was a means to an end, but it was also a way to come and, be in a place where I could do the most sailing around my studies. And
yeah.
I don't think I was fixed on the idea of the cup, but it was a dream, and I think it's a dream of a lot of people coming into ship science. So yeah.
And Joe, what about you?
Well, so I was a keen amateur sailor. I don't think I have the athlete pedigree that the other two panelists have, but I grew up racing enterprises in a reservoir outside of Sheffield, and enjoyed kind of maths and physics, and wanted to understand how things worked and how to kind of improve performance. So when I started looking at engineering and discovered I could basically do the engineering of sailing and understand the physics behind it and kind of, wider naval architecture, that was a bit of a no-brainer for me. I was really kind of, I think like Emily said, I was blown away by Southampton when I visited. It wasn't going to be my first choice because it's a long way away and I wanted to stay closer to home. But when I visited the department, it became clear that the links with kind of high performance sailing, the Wolfson unit and the research projects that the students do and everything, it just kind of made me really excited to come and learn about the physics of sailing.
Just on a general point, but because obviously you find yourself now, if you like, on the dark side as being a lecturer, so many students go to university not having any idea what they're going to end up doing. They just do a course, invariably arts subjects. I count myself in that number, but no idea what they're going to do. And it's either by osmosis or just they leave not having a clue. But by the very sort of specific nature of ship science, whatever, or related subjects, do you think there's a different perspective there that actually most students go with an inkling, at least, of where it might take them?
I think ultimately with an engineering degree, you have a job kind of available to you if you choose to go and work in engineering. But lots of our students go and do different areas as well. But I think the majority stay in the maritime sector, at least to begin with. It's a very good employer, so lots of our students get good jobs in the maritime sector, and a lot go into want to work in sailing and kind of find careers there. So I think ship science and engineering in general does give you a career option available to you at the end, but I think you've got to be excited and interested in the subject rather than it being a good kind of career at the end. I think that's important, that you kind of want to work at that area and you want to learn and are excited about it.
Emily, we said earlier you were sailing in the Ocean Race Europe only a few months ago. Because I don't know how, there's 700 people watching this. They could be in all parts of the world and they could have all kinds of sporting pedigree, which we're not aware of. But I'm guessing that not many of them would have competed at the elite level as you have. So just give us an inkling of what it's kind of like doing that.
Well, it's kind of hard because it is so different every day. I'm one of those people who really likes a schedule and a routine, and I do not get that at all with my career, especially with the offshore sailing side of things. That is just, completely out there most of the time. The general day of offshore life can be basically no sleep and just sailing a boat in all sorts of conditions, whether it's the Southern Ocean blasting down waves down there, getting washed off pedestals and not having a shower for 3 weeks and no sleep and pretty grim.
That sounds like being a student.
Oh yeah, pretty much. It was great training.
Do you ever get scared? Do you ever get scared when the waves really are coming at you big time?
Oh, yeah, of course. But I mean, there's some people who say they don't, but I've got to tell you they're lying, because if you're in the Southern Ocean and you're this tiny little boat in the middle of nowhere and you're in, 40, 50 knots of wind and big waves, there's a part of your brain that is like, stay attached to the boat right now. Like, no one's coming to help you. Like, I think that little bit of fear kind of keeps you tuned in, if anything.
And it obviously ramps up the adrenaline as well.
Oh, massively. Like, there's some moments that you just come away from just heart pounding and not really sure why, but it keeps you alert and keeps you focused. And then you have the polar opposite days that are just drifting. Or you come into the side of the sport that I'm more focused on now, which is like the inshore, the foiling. And that again is completely different, where you're kind of working with a team. I wouldn't say a 9-to-5 job. It's more like a 7 a.m. till 10 p.m. job. But you've got more of a routine. There's a much bigger focus on kind of the athleticism side of things. Offshore sailing is a lot about strength, while the inshore stuff has a lot more of like the high impact, like cardio side of things as well. So both sides of the sport keep you pretty active and pretty busy.
But do you miss the big waves?
Sorry, I think that's one of those key things about the sport, isn't it? Like, sailing is pretty unique, that you have to be so flexible as a professional. Like, not many other professional athletes have to deal with such a ridiculous range of different scenarios, organizations, and kind of, that ability to deal with lots of unknowns, and still come out winning is what makes a great sailor.
Just going off on a slight tangent, actually, I mean, because it's a team operation, isn't it? I mean, manifestly, it's a team operation. If you have one weak link on board, the whole thing can literally, not quite literally go down, but you know what I mean. So how important is that, you can be a technical whiz till you're blue in the face, but how important is it to have the human skills, if you like, to actually make the team operation work on board as well?
Oh, it's huge. It's make or break in all teams. I think in offshore, it becomes really, really obvious to the point of, when you're trialing a team, a huge part of it is just the characters you have on board and who are you going to want to spend a year of your life with going around the world. Like, are you going to end up throwing that person overboard or punching them in the face because they won't shut up? Like, all of those things make a huge difference. And
how close have you been to doing that?
Yeah, I've had my moments. I'm normally good at keeping my mouth shut when I'm annoyed. But yeah, there's definitely moments you get a bit wound up, but you would with anyone, that you're locked on a 65-foot space for a month at a time.
Let's talk to something a bit more technical than that. And the foils that you've been used to dealing with Team Ineos, James, do you think that's the single biggest advance, change, development, whatever you want to call it, that's affected the sport in recent times?
Yeah, I absolutely do. They seem new, but they're not so new now. The first moths were up and foiling in 2003, but that just redefined what high performance meant for the sport. Before then, you were kind of talking about the skiffs and asymmetrics and things, but they've just the boat speeds, the adrenaline, the risk involved in these boats is just notched up hugely. And yeah, that is high performance sailing now. I think 15 years ago you'd been shocked if you heard that people in the America's Cup were wearing helmets and carrying spare air with them and all this kind of stuff. But it's so far away from a Sunday afternoon on your local reservoir, you wouldn't believe. But there's always a space for that as well, right? That kind of sailing will always be a key part of the sport, in terms of the local club level stuff.
But I think the history of foiling is quite interesting as well, because as James said, it didn't start in the America's Cup. I mean, the technology of foiling has been around beginning of last century for powerboats. And then the moth, so it was a kind of development class, local, like, people tweaking, engineering stuff themselves and getting it working. So it's a really, it's started at the kind of grassroots and then gone up into the big leagues of sailing, which is a really interesting way the technology's evolved.
We're talking about technology, and you mentioned, James, people on their boat on the local lake. Joe, when he was, a kid outside Sheffield, a few years ago. The great debate about Formula One is always actually that what is happening in the world of Formula One actually it ultimately seeps down to, the Fiat that's in your front driveway or whatever it might be. So that all the technological work that's being done, there is a kind of a drip feed, isn't there? It might be small, but overall it enhances the product, it enhances the experience.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay, Joe.
Yeah, I think the technology, you break new barriers and you push it forward in one area, and then that gradually kind of seeps down. I guess it's probably I don't think foiling is going to replace every type of sailing. There's definitely times where foiling isn't the best option. It relies on lifting the boat up out of the water to reduce your kind of hull resistance, and at very low wind speeds and stuff, that's a challenge. So foiling's not always the best solution. And there's kind of a lot of challenges associated with the stability and control of sailing. That's why, the speeds are so high, the risks that James was highlighting. So I don't think, foiling will overtake everything, but I think we're certainly going to see a lot more of it. And the technology that will make it more accessible and easier for kind of amateur sailors to access will be interesting to see evolve, I think.
Yeah. James, you were going to say?
Yeah, I'm echoing the same things, really. The technical challenge is significant, and so you're dealing with kind of, trying to get everyone up and foiling. That's hard, and there have been various attempts, in dinghies and things to do sort of, one design foiling classes that are also affordable and, can get enough people in. And they're getting that, but, it's still, there's still a bit of a way to go, I think, before that stuff becomes, really mainstream. But it will get there.
Joe, tell us about the research that's going on at Southampton at the moment.
Well, I guess in terms of sailing in general, there's kind of a long history of ship science academics who have a personal interest in sailing and are interested in the kind of academic challenges of the sport. So there's been a long history of kind of some of the first aerodynamics work in wind tunnels was done at the university in the kind of 1960s. And then gone on to evolve the kind of computer simulations of what the flow does around the hull, the foils, to understand the fluid dynamic forces, and kind of experiments of designing hulls and optimizing the hull form, foils and appendages. We've just built a new towing tank, so we're in the final stages of commissioning a 138 meter towing tank. It'll be able to do speeds of 12 meters per second. So it reached its target speed of 12 meters per second a few weeks ago. So we're all very excited to start being able to do some high speed fluid dynamics testing, understanding foiling performance, hull shapes and stuff like that. But we've got a really broad range of kind of skill sets, I guess, within the department, from kind of doing genetic algorithms to optimize different hull forms, machine learning, the structure side, composites kind of design, making composites more efficient and green and kind of less damaging to the environment. So there's a really broad range of areas that we kind of get involved in research-wise. I guess with broader than just sailing, we've had a long partnership with the English Institute of Sport since 2005, where we've worked with different Olympic sports. So we've had over 16 PhD students in the areas of swimming, rowing, sailing, and bob skeleton. So James was one of the early NGD students working with British Skeleton. And I was one of the students who worked with swimming for the first time. And a lot of that is about understanding where to make improvements in these really small margins for success. So Olympic events are often kind of determined in fractions of a second. So understanding where you can make a change, whether that's an equipment-based development that you need to kind of evolve, or kind of develop instrumentation to measure the performance of the athlete, or assess their equipment, or develop simulation models to understand kind of what are the key factors that drive performance, and then choose the area you can do research to kind of improve that.
I'm sure everybody on this call, we may even have people on this who are actually in Japan, but I'm sure everybody will be watching the Olympics. And with your analytical eye, do you watch other sports? Will you watch other sports and say they could really benefit from X, whatever it might be, research into this or that? Do you think, I'm not suggesting that you say I can help you, but do you see areas where you think with a bit of expert analysis, it would undoubtedly improve blah, whatever that might be?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Some sports naturally have a very technical aspect of the people involved. So sailing traditionally actually has quite technically minded people involved in sailing, whereas a lot of sports are very kind of instinct and feel kind of driven. So one of the big areas we get involved in with working with different sports is trying to provide the evidence to coaches and athletes to make decisions about how they change their technique or how they select their equipment. And that's not naturally kind of embedded within the sport at a grassroots level. Whereas sailing is actually quite different. There's a lot of kind of amateur sailors who get really involved in the technical stuff and evolve that stuff by themselves as well.
That's a bit like golfers, actually, in a sense. So they may not be very good, but they love the technical aspect of the sport. But you mentioned feel and instinct. Emily, as technology becomes more and more important and data becomes more and more important, does that mean that feel and instinct gets pushed to the side, or is that still important?
No, not at all. Like, it's still hugely important. And that's one of the biggest things about my job as a performance data analyst, is that the data and technology, it's a tool. It's a very useful tool. And it's definitely a huge part of learning how to sail faster, how to push the boat to its limits. But at the end of the day, that feel, that natural instinct, it's vital, because, especially on like the big boats where you're doing 50 knots, like you don't have time to think about the split second to press a button and how that's going to affect it. So at the end of the day, it's a combination of having that just pure natural talent and skill, but then using the data as a tool to look back at what you're doing and fine tune it a small amount. And it can also be really good for kind of looking back and confirming things that we think of, whether that's, how we sailed that day and what we think happened, and checking the data to see, oh yeah, those tacks were really good because we pressed out of them a lot more. We tried to foil at a higher speed than normal, and this is what happened. And you can kind of confirm the things you feel with the numbers, which I think overall makes you better sailers.
James, I mentioned at the start. Yeah. Go on. I was
going to say there's plenty of examples of people using data to make themselves go slower as well.
That too.
over analysing, searching for an answer where there is none. You can, if you've got enough data, you can convince yourself of anything. So it's a skill to make use of that data.
I know it's a cliche, but that phrase paralysis by analysis is so true, isn't it? You can get so bogged down in it. Listen, we mentioned at the start that you're now in the world of sustainability. How do you think this whole world could improve? I don't mean the whole world. I mean this specific world of sailing. That would be a big subject, and that might take us longer than 7 o'clock. What do you think it could do in terms of improving its greenness, its eco, its sustainability?
Yeah, I guess there's probably an obvious answer to that, which is talking about things like composites recycling, and America's Cup has lots of chase boats following them around, and could you electrify those? But I think actually I'd take it back to a sort of how you change people's attitudes. Like, if anyone's been down to the River Hamble or to their local sailing club, they'll see hundreds and hundreds of totally unused boats slowly rotting away. Yeah. And there's a bit of a thing in sailing, you know, I guess it's a human nature slightly, that you have to have the latest and greatest, but there's so much, you know, so many boats and you know, so many resources out there that we could make better use of. I think, you know, going out there and building a new boat every other week is not, you know, not always the way forward. And I think if you know, if you as a somebody in sailing buying a boat, think of your kind of purchase as a sort of an investment in a company, you know, rather than just having the latest and greatest, then you're kind of, you know, we try and shift people's attitudes towards just sort of, you know, maybe buying a few less boats, but doing up the old ones, keeping things running. You know, that makes a bigger difference if lots of people take that approach for the sport.
That's a really interesting point. I'm sure there are people nodding all over the place to what you've just said about, you know, just almost any stretch of water you go past and you just see these hulls just rotting away, and you think that it's just almost, it's like a labor of love. It should be to bring it back to life. Joe, what do you think?
Well, I remember kind of growing up, kind of, you know, dinghy sailing, they're kind of like cheap wooden dinghies without kind of big budgets. And when you went to places like the Hamble and you just see all these boats, you'd be like, you know, well, why can't I go and use some of these amazing boats? No one else is using them, you know. So that really resonates with me, what James is saying. I think, you know, we have to be aware as well that actually, you know, innovation and new technology in the sport often kind of drives up kind of, you know, the cost of certain sectors of it and different fleets, which doesn't actually make it very accessible. So it'd be nice to kind of think how engineering, innovation and technology can help drive down the cost of sailing and make it more accessible to a wider kind of sector of the population, because diversity in the sport is not great, and it'd be really nice to see a much kind of broader kind of participation in general. I think there are elements of technology which can improve the specific environmental impact. So as James said, recycling of composites, kind of reusing the materials and designing boats with recycling in mind. So that's built into the design process, that you're thinking about how you recycle them, reuse them at the end, rather than it being an afterthought that you then have to kind of work out how to do when the boat's reached its end of its useful life.
You used the word diversity there. Emily, I almost apologise for mentioning this because it's in a way, I'm sure you think it's just a very boring subject. But do people say to you, God, I'm amazed that you compete at that level. You know, do many women do it? Has the balance of power shifted, if you like, in the last 5 or 6 years?
It still does my head in, to be honest. Pretty much every interview I get from journalists, whether it's about the ocean race or trialing with Sail GP last week, it's always, oh, so you're female in the sport, how do you feel about that? And it's always about the sexism that I see and how much harder it is for me as a female sailor. And to be honest, I'm quite tired of it, because it is difficult.
Is it any harder for you? Because surely if you were no good, you'd be out, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I mean, I look at people I competed against a few years ago, you know, with the Youth America's Cup and where they've gone to, and, you know, the extra hurdles that I've had to face. There is a difference in salaries with some teams. A lot of time it is a boys' club. There's a lot of big boats that are owned by private owners, and you know what? When they're away racing in places like Porto and Monaco, they're there with their lads. It's a lads' week out, and you know, at the end of the day, like, they own the boat. It is their decision. Does it suck for me that I then don't get to race at the Maxi Worlds or events like that because there's no space on a lot of the boats for a female? Yeah, I would like that pay in that event and to enjoy it.
But can I just say, Mario, Monaco is grossly overrated. So just want to forget that, honestly. Listen,
absolutely.
We've done half an hour and we've got so many questions coming in. So I will stop. I will act as the facilitator, if you like, now, and just rattle through these. And thank you it's on the Q&A thing on your screen. So if you've got a question you want to ask, maybe off the back of what people have said already, or you can take the conversation in any direction you want to do. But anyway, first in debate, Chris Rowlands. We've touched on this a bit, but I'm sure there are other elements of this. A lot of people, I'm sure, in the audience will be sailors, and we've had a number of questions on dinghy sailing in. From experience, do you think a dinghy sailor can use the science of sailing to make their boat go faster? Pretty basic and fundamental question. Who wants to take that?
I can make a start. Yeah, I mean, certainly. There's so much out there, you know, in terms of resources on the internet, and so much knowledge that you can use to take back to your own sailing. What I would counsel, and kind of touched on what I mentioned earlier, is, you know, sometimes that analysis for someone as a dinghy sailor is great because that's the way their mind works, and that kind of logical processing of data is great. And for other people, feel is more important. And if you think you're a feel person, don't rush to the data. You know, use your feel first, and then try and pick out what you need. You know, because it's so easy to get lost. You know, if you're going out there and kind of logging data and measuring, to just spend time on that and not realize that you're actually, you know, you're just not hiking as hard because you're thinking about whether your data log is working or whatever.
Emily, you were nodding your head.
Yeah, so I agree with everything that James has said, but it's also that idea that, yeah, there are loads of tools out there if, like, you are the technical minded side of things and you do like the numbers. Currently, I'm doing some work with the British sailing team to kind of get into the data side a bit more. And, you know, there are tools out there that you can put on a 49er, on a laser, or on a moth. And I mean, you don't get much more basic than a laser. So if laser sailors can log some data, you know, any dinghy class can. And it's still, you know, if you're out there and you're still learning to tack and jibe, let's leave the data to a later point and focus on that. Like, get yourself going fast, work on your maneuvers. They're far more important. But, you know, when you are at like the higher end of the sport and you want to figure out what the tiny differences are, there's plenty of tools out there that you can use. You know, if you want cheap options, there are a few out there. There's some that are really expensive, but, you know, you can have apps that you literally put on your phone and stick that in a waterproof case and put it in your life jacket and try not to lose it. And you can get a GPS track out of it. So yeah, there's options out there, but it's a tool. It's not the be all and end all.
Okay, listen, so many questions. I'll rattle on to another one. Tim, this is an obvious one for you, Joe, from Tim Haynes. Is a strong scientific understanding important in improving your ability as a sailor?
Well, I was about to, it kind of follows on nicely from the question there, because I actually think, I don't think it's necessary, but a lot of the way we learn to sail and the tools we use instinctively out on the water, like telltales on the sail and the feel, are all based on the physics that's going on around you. And if you've got some understanding of what's happening, so I think sail trimming is a really good example of that. If you understand what the flow is doing around the sails and what the telltales are showing you and what you're trying to achieve, then that helps you understand and kind of understand how to improve. So I think there's definitely aspects like that. And other stuff we often get questions about, kind of like, you know, is there a magic coating you can put on the hull of the boat to reduce your resistance? And
somebody's asked that very question. Seriously.
Yeah. Well, but it's about just understanding that, you know, you want a clean hull. You don't, you know, on a yacht, kind of a kind of weed and growth is the worst thing. So clean hull to start with, nice and smooth. But it's mainly around the bow and the foils where you've got nice laminar flow. So you can focus where you put your effort onto your, you know, boat prep if you know where it's going to have the biggest impact.
Okay, talking about impact, that word is in this question from James Weston. With foils having already made such a huge impact on sailing performance, what do you think will be the equivalent with sail technology?
Well, it's a big one. I'll jump in there, but I don't think you're able to kind of predict the kind of, you know, disruptive technology that will, you know, flood the market and change it. Everything happens quite kind of, you know, slowly. But I think there's obvious areas where there's going to be more research and evolve the sport. I think the dynamics of kind of yachts and vessels in general is still one of the challenges. The performance of vessels in kind of waves and in the dynamic conditions and maneuvers. So there's lots of work still to be done on the kind of control and dynamics. And I think, you know, the understanding the person, the athlete in that process, and trying to look at it holistically, not just the technology by itself and the hull design, but how you kind of the athlete responds to that and involving the athlete in that process. Because ultimately, if you design a boat that can go a little bit faster, but it's very hard to get to perform well in that mode, then that won't necessarily be better over a race or over a lot. Certainly offshore racing, when people get tired, are they going to be able to kind of keep it in that very narrow groove? So there's a lot of kind of more kind of holistic approaches to understanding the performance of the boats.
Mentioning all the research there, where is this? I mean, obviously at Southampton, but where is this research being done? How widespread around the world? Is this in America, in Australia? Where are the hubs where this is happening?
I mean, it is quite a small world in terms of kind of, sailing kind of technology. So there's a few different kind of research groups around the world that do work in this area. A lot of the research, I mean, what we find at Southampton, a lot of our research is done by our students. We have kind of really keen students who are excited about kind of learning about the sport. And so as part of their individual project in their third year and as part of their group design project, they go and do something new, and they supported and supervised by academics who have interest in those areas, but they can really do some amazing stuff. And I think that's the same around the world as well. A lot of the sailing research done at universities is through student projects. And then you've got kind of, the likes of America's Cup, where they're actually paying for research themselves to do stuff. But, generally sailing budgets, and research is small compared to a lot of other sectors. So there's not a lot of research money being kind of flooded around there to push these things forward.
Okay, Emily and James, feel free to say no to this, because this may be a very unfair question, but interesting that Joe should say that. Was in your time at Southampton, Emily, was there something, first year, second year, third year, whatever, when you just thought, God, that is just so interesting? There was a moment when you thought, wow, that I may not be, reinventing the wheel here, but this is really interesting as part of what I'm studying.
Okay, this is going to sound really, really cheesy, but it was like third and fourth year when we started specializing. And for me, doing the module that Joe teaches with the high performance yacht and small craft, it was just like, that was the moment where I was like, yeah, this is really what I want to do. Originally, I thought I was going to kind of go more like oceanography, like equipment side of things. And I just absolutely loved looking at the high performance side of sailing. My final year project was designing and building foils for an F-18. And I just loved every minute of that project. We had a group of 6 and 2 of us were making the foils. 2 of us were making a way to attach the foils to a boat, and the other 2 were doing some electronic instruments to data log. And it's funny looking back on it because it turned out to be so relevant for what my career has turned into. And at the time I had no idea. It was just, that looks really cool. It's based on the America's Cup that I'm obsessively following. That will be such a great way to spend a year. And it really was just learning how everything was made. And at the time, I thought, that it'll be way more serious in like the real world. They don't use homemade ovens to build foils. It's not this random. And then 6 months after I graduated, I was working at SoftBank, and the first thing I see when I walk into the shed is a homemade oven because there wasn't one big enough for their foils. So
the way your face lit up by reminiscing, we can just see the enthusiasm, just the absolute basic, the love of it. Listen, as I say, too many questions, so I'm going to rattle through these because I'll get as many in as we can do. And this, I think, is obviously aimed at you, James. On the eco question, this is from Clifford Aris. What about the use of wind power in foil-driven boats and passenger ships? Why has wind power failed to take off in this field?
So there are people working on it right now. There's a group based that kind of spun out of the Artemis America's Cup team that are working on foil-powered passenger craft. Maybe not so much wind power, but then the wind power side of it, there's plenty of people doing wind power for commercial shipping. So it's coming together. It's happening. The sort of historically the problems have been.
Could I just chip in for a sec, James? Because it just seems to me, boats on water, wind, they're pretty close to each other. So isn't it the most obvious thing to have, or is that oversimplistic?
No, at some level it is, but until you're foiling and until you can actually travel at a decent speed, you're not commercially viable for most routes, with passengers. But there are cases now, probably even on the Solent maybe, but those short passenger trips where there's no reason why wind-powered hydrofoil craft could compete. There are probably different,
But if you look at it in isolation as well, if you think of the wind powered, there's many new commercial vessels being built specifically designed to be propelled by sails or kites or Flettner rotors, rotating cylinders that generate a thrust forward. So this is changing rapidly at the moment, and it's an area we've had lots of students do projects in the wind tunnel, looking at the aerodynamics of this and working out how to go on and do that, and it's happening in the industry at the moment. So in a few years' time, there'll be more of these vessels out operating that we'll all see.
Really interesting. Okay. From Ben Fallat, sailboarding shows advantages of foils at the top of the wind range and a fin at the other end, offering sailors the choice. Do you see the convergence or further divergence between traditional appendages and hydrofoils? Who wants to take that?
I can try. Sorry, Emily, go ahead.
I think there's always going to be a place for both. You look at kind of the event I think he's probably referring to, had most sailors in the windier end using traditional appendages, with some then choosing to use foils. And the winner of, I think, one of the windsurfing events, smashed everyone with the foil. But then someone else who didn't have quite as much control and tried to use a foil was at the back of the fleet. So it completely depends on your own abilities, but also kind of what you feel comfortable with at the end of the day. There's things you can do with foils that you can't do with normal boats.
Sorry, interesting question from Charles Bossier. Could you explain what happened during the Vendée Globe with so many major structural failures of boats and foils? Was that teething problems for new technology, or new technology being pushed too far too quickly? That's a good question.
I would say it's a combination of both. With the Vendée Globe, you're always pushing to have the boat as light as possible. I did do some of the design work with some of the teams, and that you're pushing to have that boat as light and the layers of carbon as thin as possible, which improves performance until you then have a failure, and then it's catastrophic. And so, it's this case for the foils of you're pushing as hard as you can, you're right on that limit of the technology, but you're using them in pretty serious conditions. So it's always a risk you're going to run. And it's situations like that where, the old technology, the non-foilers are actually going to come out stronger because they might be more conservative, but it makes them better in a more well-rounded sense of they can deal with windier, wavier conditions, and they're not going to break in those sort of situations.
And I think this has always been
heavier and slower.
I was going to say, I think this has always been the case with the Vendée Globe, whether it was foiling's just the latest technology that is experiencing this, but canting keels, lots of problems with system failures or keels falling off. And, when you're pushing the bounds and developing something new, you kind of, it's a bit of trial and error, and you have to kind of go out and see what works in the real world. And the dynamic kind of wavy conditions, the loads are huge and they're very hard to kind of predict numerically and stuff. So it is, it takes time for these technologies to bed in and for people to fully understand where the kind of reliability kind of, factors need to be increased, I guess.
And you can never take, in all sport, you can never take human error out of the equation, can you?
No, exactly. I mean, the Vendée is just insane. If you're a person on that boat, the weakest link on those boats now is the human by a long shot. And there are some incredible humans doing the Vendée. It's so brutal being on, and Emily, knows well, being on those boats offshore, doing those speeds, that once upon a time you take a step forward in terms of technology, the human could kind of keep up and keep their eyes out the boat and look out for potential issues. It happens so fast. It's so brutal now that, the boats really are, running ahead of their sailors, and so I think that's probably where the limit lies more than the technology itself.
From that perspective, Emily, when you're on the ocean and you're on a boat, but there's new technology on board, if you like, or you're not experimenting, but you're aware that it's the early stages of a new development. Do you treat it carefully, or do you think, let's see if this damn thing works?
There's a bit of both. I've done a couple of offshores with new technology. I did New York to Bermuda on a foiling catamaran that had never actually been offshore before. And during that, it did turn conservative quite quickly, just because of the conditions, and it got a bit sketchy. Great fun, but sketchy. But then last summer, I did a transatlantic with the 11th Hour racing IMOCA, which had new foils on it, which hadn't really been tested offshore, but it was more of a race team. So it was, we just send it and see what it can do and light it up, and hopefully it's all fine.
I'm interested by that bike behind you. Is that some super deluxe carbon bike that weighs about 2 kilos?
It is carbon, but it's not that super deluxe. It's not as fancy as my housemate's bike, but it works for me, and it's pretty.
That's all that matters. Listen, just a couple of questions about the university, and actually, Joe, about the work that you do. Saying this question, it's just my thing's just logged out of here, from Garland Ng, saying, how important is academic research? You're having to justify your job here, but anyway, how important is academic research in the future development of all sailing technology?
I think it's in different areas. So a lot of the kind of blue sky kind of fundamental research is done quite removed from the sport, and you explore different areas, and then the things that have potential then kind of get adopted by kind of different race teams or evolved further by kind of a mixture of industry and kind of universities. So that sort of level of research is kind of important generally in science and technology. I think the other area that we do a lot, because we do a lot of our research with our students, essentially doing their own projects and stuff, it's partly a training process as well, that our students get the experience of doing kind of simulations of the flow around something, or experimental testing in the towing tank or the wind tunnel, and that hands-on practical kind of experience, or the kind of developing the numerical skills to do simulations, they take out into industry and apply. So the university kind of has two kind of different ways of kind of having impact through our students and our alumni, and through the research that we publish, and then some of that kind of goes on and feeds into other kind of sports or teams, and they pick that up.
So do you think you could be an academic doing the kind of work you do and not be a sailor, not be somebody who cycles, whatever it might be? Can you do it almost one removed?
Yeah, so I think you have different levels of kind of motivation and engagement. So some kind of academics who are involved in some of the sports research really are interested in the kind of complex problems that come with sport. I mean, sailing is such a complicated sport. There's so many different factors at play. You've got the environment, the weather, the kind of changing sea state. It's not a controlled environment at all. So some of those challenges are just interesting from an academic point of view. But a lot of the people have some sporting background, and they can transfer that to another sport. So we've got kind of academics who are really keen kind of hockey players, but they that kind of competitive nature and that understanding of kind of a kind of competitive sport allows them to engage with all kinds of different sports and apply kind of the fundamental engineering tools and understanding to help improve performance across any kind of sport.
Okay. Right, we've got 10 minutes to go, so let's get through half a dozen more if we can quickly. From Pablo Sopolana, how do you see wing sails being used more in sailing? James, maybe?
Yeah, it's an interesting one from the perspective of the Cup, because for the 2017 Cup, we obviously ran solid wing sails, and there was a lot of question marks about, is this practical, et cetera, and then for the last edition of the Cup, we went back to twin skin but soft sails, And you quickly realize that the budget required to do a twin spin soft sail is just, vastly larger. And the complexity of setting them up is that much more than a solid wing sail. So it's not always a question of simplicity, they're more simple than you think, but they have their issues in terms of land-based rigging side of things. But solid wing sails are, they are the right solution from a purely engineering point of view, for plenty of, for a performance boat. And the question is, how do you get around those sort of practical issues? And I'm sure, people are experimenting with various different methods with it, inflatables and reefable solid sails, and they will filter down into the into sailing. They might even make a comeback in America's Cup one day.
There's a great question. Go on, John.
I was going to say that's an area as well, because of the uptake of wind propulsion in commercial shipping, and wing sails are kind of one of the big kind of technologies that they're planning on using. And therefore, these are going to be out on vessels operating in the ocean all the time. So they have to be reefable, controllable. So all of that understanding and technology that will be evolved to make that work from a commercial ship point of view will allow that kind of understanding to evolve down into smaller sailing craft as well as that kind of trickle down approach.
Great question here from John and Joy Stokes. I'm not sure if it's a slightly tongue-in-cheek question, but anyway, the software in self-driving cars is able to react to so many scenarios better than human drivers. Do you ever anticipate that this will come into sailing?
Yes, it's there.
Is it?
For the purpose of the America's Cup, you have to have a human in the loop, but you have a lot of help from the onboard software. And for the purposes of testing, many teams choose for the computer to basically run the show, because they're a lot better than the humans. Obviously, you can't race like that, but it's a vitally important part of any cup campaign these days. If you're a student out there at the moment and control systems is your thing, you'll find a spot in a cup.
It raises quite an interesting point, though, in terms of how much is it going to be? Do we want sailing to be about the sailors or the technology? And it's not mutually exclusive. You can have different events that have different kind of rules, but we're entering a different world of sailing, I guess, with the kind of complexity of foiling and control, where the computer becomes far more important, and it changes the nature of the sport.
And can that computer, James, react instantly to a rogue wave that just appears from nowhere? Is there always the possibility that, I don't know, a 0.01% possibility that something will happen and you just can't? Technology just can't react to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the same problem for self-driving cars. You're learning a set of behaviors, and when you get a really extreme edge case, it's the system can struggle with it, but for the vast majority of the time, they do a really good job. And it's sort of a question of continuous learning and system development to kind of iron out those those sometimes not insignificant problems. But yeah,
as an international athlete, Emily, how does the prospect of a self-driving boat grab you?
Well, the thing is, it's already there. Like it's filtered down to the lower levels as well. I mean, within SailGP, the data team and systems are always joking about the fact they could take over the boats and control them from off the water. But you look at, offshore sailing, down to the local cruises that you take your family offshore on, they have autopilots. And while a lot of them that, the general public are using are pretty simple, you put in a heading, you put in a true wind angle and you go. There's some out there, especially for like the Vendée Globe, that are insanely complicated. Like there is so much information inputted into it that, the guys are choosing not to drive. They'll go around the world and hardly ever drive. For the occasional maneuver, they'll take the helm, or if conditions are particularly bad or there's a breakdown, they might do some. But most of the time, everyone's quite happy to admit the fact that, the computer can drive better than me. I'm going to go faster if I leave that to drive, and I'll trim the sails.
And those tools are the path towards foiling you know, becoming something that you might do on your cruising boat of a weekend, you know, because the control problem, you're not going to want to sit there sipping your G&T while trying to keep the way out of the water yourself. But if you do want to go somewhere fast, you know, those control systems, those autopilots, are, you know, they will filter down and they will turn up for sure in kind of, you know, day-to-day sailing space.
Okay. This is the last 4 or 5 minutes, and so I think this is a generic topic which I'm sure you'll all have. Well, it's addressed to all of you, really, from Alice Reed. And there may well be, wherever you may be in the world, if you're 17, 18 years old as an embryonic university student, or maybe you're the parent of somebody who has aspirations in this sector, Alice Reed says, what advice would you have for students looking to get into this discipline, looking to do these courses, looking to get into some kind of supporting role in sport like INEOS or related disciplines? Emily, should I start with you?
Sure. I would say my biggest advice is just really chase what you really enjoy doing and not to be afraid of doing something different, even if it's not necessarily what you studied at school or what you studied at university. There's loads of opportunities to get involved in, like with the sports side, the data side, technology. There's always an opportunity out there. And for me personally, you know, I went into engineering thinking I would go a very different route. I thought I'd go into like the robotics and oceanography side, and then realized I could combine it with sport. And, you know, that's where my heart really was and what I really enjoyed doing. But I actually only followed the naval architecture design side for 6 months, a year. And then I switched to focusing on sport, and then, you know, being like, okay, I've got to meet it in the middle somewhere, and brought the data side into there. But again, it was, you know, it was pretty rogue from me, and wasn't exactly what I'd studied, and it wasn't exactly the degree, but it all helped. So it's the case of, you know, do what you enjoy, but don't feel like you have to do something just because you've studied it for X amount of years.
James?
Yeah, I'd echo that. I think, you know, there's in terms of technical roles, there's no substitute for, you know, a decent grounding in maths and physics and things like that. But beyond that, there's no really clear career path in this kind of world, and you have to make the most of the opportunities as they arrive, even if they seem somewhat tangential to where.
Isn't that the best thing about it in many ways?
Yeah, it is. There's a, you know, if you got a ship science degree, it's pretty flexible. There's lots of people, you know, looking for people with those skills in all sorts of different areas. And, you know, don't shut down an opportunity just because you think you're heading over here. You wind up coming back to it, you know, by hook or by crook, if that's where you want to go long term. You know, for me personally, going out and doing stuff with kind of Olympic sport was, you know, from where I came from, starting ship science was a bit of a sidetrack, but, you know, it got me, you know, it was a fantastic experience, and without it I wouldn't have then had the opportunity in the Cup, for example, you know.
And were you desperate to get on that skeleton bob yourself?
I did a few weeks of trying it out. I did a championships. Hopefully the result sheet is long lost. But
well, Emily was saying that occasionally she gets scared on the water. How scary was it on that skeleton bob? Skeleton
and bobs, they are always scary, no matter how many times you've done it. The exposure is just ridiculous. It never goes away, and it's just shattered from a physical perspective as well. You only have to do a couple of runs a day, and then you're just wiped out from the adrenaline of it. I'd recommend that anyone else giving that go.
I can imagine. I apologise for the noises off. That's my Joe, I'm going to hit mute in a minute and go and tell him to shut up. Joe, what's your answer to Alice about career advice and what the future may hold?
I think you've got to follow what you're interested in. So, you know, to work hard at something and stay motivated, you've got to be excited about it. So I think following your kind of interest and your passion is really important. if you want to work in the science and engineering kind of aspect of in any field really, then maths is really important. It opens up a lot of the other more kind of exciting applied areas. But so if you're thinking about subjects at school, then maths is really important to go on to do engineering. But kind of focus on what you're excited about, and I think take opportunities, go in different directions when it's interesting and you're excited about it.
I know you actually want to sort of say something at the end on behalf of all the ship science academics.
Well, yeah, I just want to, I'm representing a whole group of ship science academics. I wanted to kind of, thank, our alumni, so Emily and kind of James, and it's great to hear what they've gone on to do and their experiencing. So that's been brilliant. Thank you very much for joining in with this event. And if anyone is interested in studying ship science or studying at Southampton, then do kind of, get in touch with us. We'll post a link with open days that are coming up. So we're running on-campus open days in September. So 11th and 12th of September, and they line up with the Southampton Boat Show. So you can come and see the Southampton Boat Show and come and visit us on campus at Southampton. We'd love to see you and answer any of your questions.
Very shrewd planning by whoever decided that. A smug look on your face. It does. I'm sure a lot of people, if they are in that bracket who've been listening to this for the last hour, will genuinely have been inspired. I mean, I honestly feel that as somebody who's outside your world, I could imagine being 16, 17 or whatever, listening to what you've been saying, thinking, God, I fancy a bit of that. It would be just great. And I should actually say that if you want to watch this lecture again, or you want to show it to kids or whoever it might be, we're going to share the footage over the coming days. So if you keep an eye on your inbox, wherever you may be, you'll be able to see how to access that. And also, I ought to say in a moment that you're going to see a short poll on your screen, which we'd actually like you to complete. It will literally take you a minute or so to do that. Listen, we've done our hour and it just flew by. So thank you so much to Joe, James, Emily. It's just been great fun. I hope you've enjoyed it. And I hope, if you're watching in Andalusia or Antarctica or Alaska or wherever you may be and you've been part of this, I hope you've enjoyed it as well. And wherever you are in the world, I hope you enjoy watching the sailing and all the other sports that are part of the Tokyo Olympics, which obviously begin sort of full blown, if you like, tomorrow. But thank you very much to each and every one of you, and enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you may be in the world. Thanks a lot for that.